Welcome back, everyone, to another YouTube video where this time we'll be doing the closing to the 2001 VHS of Tora, the attack on Pearl Harbor. This one is the special edition in honor of this Memorial Day weekend.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Planes were coming in, torpedoes were exploding against the sides of warships. One Japanese high-level bomber dropped what had originally been an armor-piercing projectile for a battleship, made into an armor-piercing bomb, dropped from about 10,000 feet, penetrated down into the heart of the Arizona, set off the powder magazines, and about 10 minutes after 8, a cataclysmic explosion that really destroyed the ship, killed hundreds of men just in an instant.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor causes approximately 3,000 total American casualties, 2,400 killed, of which roughly 1,100 are off the Arizona, and 1,200 wounded.
Approximately 200 aircraft are destroyed and very heavily damaged in the islands and not really salvageable. All of the battleships in the harbor are either destroyed or heavily damaged.
The entire nation was convulsed by the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 8, 1941, before a joint session of Congress, President Roosevelt asked them to declare war against the Empire of Japan. With the exception of one vote, Congress unanimously votes to declare war against Japan. 3 days later, on December 10, 1941, Germany and Italy declare war against the United States. Pearl Harbor became strategically important with the Spanish-American War and the United States gaining new overseas possessions such as the Philippines and Guam. These were taken from the Spanish in the Spanish-American War of 1898. The Hawaiian Islands are roughly halfway between the Philippines and the United States west coast. Whoever controlled the Hawaiian Islands basically could cut off United States communications with its possessions and could also threaten the west coast. So the Hawaiian Islands were annexed by the United States in 1899. The naval base was started shortly thereafter with a coaling base, and as time went on, the base there became larger and larger.
The United States fleet was based in Hawaiian waters, beginning with a small increment in the fall of 1939 with the Hawaiian detachment. And the fleet operated in that area for Fleet Problem 21 in 1940. And the fleet was retained there to base on Pearl Harbor. Most thought as a deterrent to Japan.
The Japanese are facing obvious resistance from the U.S. government for Japanese policies in China and in Southeast Asia. The U.S. government is saying, stop fighting in China. The Chinese people have done you no wrong. Why are you there? Stop this aggression.
Japan felt increasingly threatened as 1941 proceeded. by cutting off of natural resources that could fuel the war machine. After all, they'd been at war with China since 1937.
The U.S. government tightens trade embargoes against Japan so that no longer can Japanese companies get access to credits from the United States. They cannot get access to scrap metal from the United States, and they cannot get access to oil from the United States. That oil problem for the Japanese is a key one. Without oil, they cannot support their war that's going on already in China.
You must understand is that the attack on Pearl Harbor was an ancillary movement to what was called the movement to the south. The Japanese were primarily interested in the raw materials of the Netherlands East Indies, which has large amounts of oil, plus Malaya, which has rubber, tin, tungsten, the items needed for a modern industrial state.
Isoroku Yamamoto was commander-in-chief of the combined fleet of the Japanese Navy. Very skillful, accomplished naval officer. He had duty in the United States. He knew the American capabilities. He knew the American mind. He was a gambler. He loved to play Japanese games that involved risk-taking, and this was the biggest risk of his life.
Well, you must understand in Japanese military tradition, the surprise attack is very much a part of their military thinking. The most famous one being in 1905 at Port Arthur during the Russo-Japanese War. Admiral Yamamoto insisted that the attack on Pearl Harbor take place.
The Japanese plan was very well conceived tactically. Commander Gendo was brilliant in that regard, knew that it would take a combination of torpedo planes, dive bombers, high-level bombers, and a fighter cover to bring this off. And they knew that Pearl Harbor had very shallow water, would not be conducive to firing normal aerial launch torpedoes. So they had to fix fins to their torpedoes so that they would run more shallowly and would not go into the mud of Pearl Harbor. They had to get together a logistic force that included oilers to refuel the ships. They had accompanying escort ships, gathered them all up in the North Pacific in the Kuril Islands, and practiced dive bombing, practiced firing torpedoes, and were kept there sort of on a leash until found out the results of the Japanese diplomatic efforts. Ambassador Nomura and the envoy Kurusu were in Washington talking with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, trying to get some modus vivendi, some way that the two nations could coexist peacefully. And then the signal would go out at a certain date in late November if they couldn't work something out, and indeed that's the way it happened.
The Japanese force departs from the northern part of Japan, where it had been concealed from American view for a period of about a month beforehand. It leaves in late November 1941, sailing by a northern course across the Pacific Ocean that will bring it into a striking position from the north of Hawaii, not from the west of Hawaii, but from the north of Hawaii, beginning on the 23rd of November 1941. And on the way, it maintains absolute radio silence. Its mission is to attack Pearl Harbor, but it does not transmit any signals to betray its position. So the American fleet at Pearl Harbor has no clue of where the Japanese Navy's main striking force is located. And when I say main striking force, I'm talking about the cream of the Japanese Navy. 6 large aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and assorted cruisers and destroyers as escorts, plus some submarines that are there to act as scouts if need be. There were about 350 aircraft on the Japanese aircraft carriers that could be used for a strike against Pearl Harbor.
One of the questions that always comes up with regard to Pearl Harbor is, why was the fleet so unprepared? The problem was, the mindset was, it couldn't happen here. Look at the map and see how far away Hawaii is from Japan, the Western Pacific.
Starting in January of 1941, Admiral Husband Kimmel, who was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, has his fleet in Hawaii ready to respond to any Japanese aggression as needed. He is, at that time, exercising the fleet, but at the same time faces a serious problem because his own forces are being drawn off to the Atlantic to respond to the German threat that is posed to the United States. And President Roosevelt wants those forces in the Atlantic fleet. So he's losing some of his strength to the Atlantic.
Admiral Kimmel's role in preparing the fleet for war was to make sure that it was ready for action with Japan when the war started. And to that end, the fleet was constantly engaging in exercises. They'd be at sea during the week and in port during the weekends, which unfortunately allowed the Japanese intelligence operatives on Oahu to get an accurate picture of what the fleet would be doing and when. Husband Kimmel's chief opposite number on Oahu was Lieutenant General Walter Short, who was the commander of the Army's Hawaiian Department. Short basically was an infantry officer.
He was in charge of the defense of Fortress Hawaii. The specific instructions from the Chief of Staff, General Marshall, was the protection of the fleet when it was based at Pearl Harbor. So he was ultimately responsible for the air defense and the ground defense of Oahu.
He saw his main duty as guarding against sabotage on Oahu, which meant that his aircraft would be parked close together. There was not a great understanding on his part of his mission, which basically was to defend the fleet.
He had set up 3 levels of alert. Level 1, which was defense against sabotage. Level 2, which was defense against sabotage and air attack. And level 3, which was defense against invasion of Oahu or the Hawaiian Islands. At the time of the attack, his defense level was level 1.
Notify Com 14 that we've dropped depth charges on a sub operating in our security zone.
Probably the most overt warning that the Americans had as the attack approached came when the USS Ward attacked a Japanese midget submarine outside the harbor in an area where no American submarines were supposed to be. The commanding officer of the Ward, Lieutenant Commander Outerbridge, sent in a message, said that he had attacked a submarine. He made it clear that it was a submarine, not an unidentified object. Lieutenant Kaminsky, back at Pearl Harbor, tried to get the word passed on, but people were just not in a mindset to respond quickly. They weren't on an alert war footing because they had not had the idea in mind that attack was imminent.
There were a variety of warnings received by the commanders in Hawaii before the Pearl Harbor attack that could have been read to say that an attack was on the way. Certainly, there's a warning about sabotage that comes in November of 1941, but in fact, there are war warnings that you can argue go back to January of 1941 with the potential that something could take place. Indeed, Admiral Husband Kimmel had replaced his predecessor because his predecessor said the base at Pearl Harbor is too vulnerable and the Navy there is too vulnerable. We can be attacked here. The most immediate warning, however, and the one that's perhaps the most controversial, is the warning that comes on the morning of December 7th. It's transmitted from General George Marshall and Admiral Harold Stark, the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Chief of Naval Operations, on the morning of December 7th from Washington, and it's sent to all of American Pacific bases at that time. It is received, however, and sent through civilian channels because the messages are not transmittable through military channels on the morning of 7 December. As a consequence, the message takes its time and is received at the American Naval Headquarters far too late for it to be any good after the Japanese attack has gone in and left.
Admiral Kimmel and General Short taking the major thrust of the blame. There are many who feel that this was unfair, that there was blame to go all around. The others, however, feel that Kimmel and Short were the men on the scene. So Short and Kimmel were the men on top. They were responsible. Did they fully utilize the assets and resources they had? Those are those who argue said no. The war warning of 27 November 1941 should have given them enough notice to say, well, I have to be prepared for everything, not just sabotage.
Admiral Husband Kimmel was the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He was vaulted over a number of more senior officers to take that post. He relieved Admiral James O. Richardson February of 1941. He was a detail man. He was obsessed with details, down to rounds of ammunition expended in target practice. microscopically focused on readiness training to the detriment of the readiness of the fleet. He was so focused on his offensive job when the war started that defensive preparations were not part of his mindset.
One of the things that's seized upon by the conspiracy theory proponents is that the Americans had the ability to break Japanese codes and read Japanese messages. That was primarily the Japanese diplomatic messages. We were not able to read the Japanese naval operational messages, and there's still some controversy, people who believe that we were.
There are two schools of historic thought on the attack on Pearl Harbor. One is the traditional historians, and the movie Tora, Tora, Tora tends to follow their interpretation of the attack on the island of Oahu. The other school of thought is what are usually called the revisionist historians. The revisionists tend to feel that President Roosevelt, through various factors, including the Purple Codes, knew about the attack beforehand. But because he wanted to bring the United States into the Second World War and was facing an isolationist Congress, kept this information from the commanders at Pearl Harbor and allowed the attack to happen and bring the United States into the war. Ambassador Grew was the United States ambassador to Japan. In January 1941, Ambassador Grew claimed that he was approached by a Peruvian ambassador who claimed that he had heard a conversation that if the negotiations which had been going on between the United States and Japan did not really prove fruitful from the Japanese point of view, that they would have attacked Pearl Harbor. This was never, ever confirmed.
There are people who believe that Franklin Roosevelt, in effect, sacrificed the Pacific Fleet to get the United States into World War II. I think that this is a seriously flawed explanation for what happened at Pearl Harbor. For Franklin Roosevelt to actually sacrifice 2,400 Americans to get the United States into World War II is hard for me to believe at all. He was very loyal to the American public as a president, first and foremost. And why would Franklin Roosevelt want to start off American involvement in World War II with an American defeat? When Franklin Roosevelt had met with Winston Churchill in August of 1941 in Argentia, Newfoundland, at the Atlantic, where they signed the Atlantic Charter, his main concern was not Japan. His main concern was Germany. Franklin Roosevelt was very interested in getting the United States involved in a war with Germany. But this was not the German Navy or the German Air Force attacking Hawaii. It was the Imperial Japanese Navy. In other words, it was an opponent completely different from the one he wanted to fight at that time.
One of the, I think, the misconceptions about Pearl Harbor is that it destroyed the fleet. The total number of ships actually lost to the war effort was very small. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the Utah. But almost every other ship was either repaired or rebuilt and re-entered the fight. Another thing that was looked at as probably providential was that the fleet was actually in Pearl Harbor. Had the fleet been at sea or off Lahaina, which was the alternative anchorage for the fleet, which are deep water areas, any ship sunk in those waters would be lost. You would never recover the ship, not the least of which you'd never recover the crew. Another factor that is good to keep in mind is that the aircraft carriers were not in port.
For a sailor, the idea of being trapped in a sunken ship is probably one of the most horrifying thoughts or scenarios that one can contemplate. The Oklahoma, because she did not counterflood, there were other battleships that took many heavy hits, but because of what's called counter-flooding, where you flood the other side of the ship where we're taking the holes, the ship will sink even keel. But for various reasons, this did not happen on the Oklahoma. She took 7 torpedoes, and so she turns turtle. Sailors that were trapped on the lower decks, they did not know whether or not they would be saved, and some of them were not. When the Oklahoma was salvaged, eventually they did find sailors in dry compartments who had lived for many, many days after the attack.
The attack, in many cases, tore families apart, lost loved ones, in some cases sets of brothers on board the same ship. On the Arizona, there were several sets of brothers who were killed the same morning.
when Americans hear the date 7 December 1941, and what I hear, when I think of when I hear that date in particular, is first of all the importance of remembrance of the sacrifices that Americans have made to get where we are in the world today, in war and in peace, and sometimes that involves going to war to defend American values. That means that Pearl Harbor, to me at least, represents a fundamental time that we should recall, not as a time to hate anyone in the world, but to remember that sometimes we have to work very hard to protect our interests, to protect ourselves, and to protect what we value, most importantly, our values in the world, and to fight for it. And I think that it's sort of the prime example of what the United States can be and how the United States can work to defend and protect those values for the rest of time.
Alright, that wraps up the 2001 VHS closing to Tora, the attack on Pearl Harbor. If you enjoy, hit the subscribe button and turn on that post notification bell. I'll see you in my next Memorial Day VHS and DVD opening.